What are Monmouth County schools doing to help children with special needs? Find out next on Outlook Monmouth. Welcome to Outlook Monmouth. I'm Armen McOmber, your host. Schools in New Jersey are doing more than ever to educate children with special needs. The law requires that disabled students must receive an individualized education and, if possible, be educated with regular education students. School districts are working hard to provide educational options within the district as opposed to sending students to private placements. However, with the increasing number of special education students and with both the state of New Jersey and local school districts facing an economic crisis, the high cost for these services is becoming a major challenge for school districts throughout the state. We're fortunate to have with us today Andrew Orefice, who serves as the Superintendent of Schools for the Borough of Oceanport School District. Prior to accepting the position as Superintendent, Mr. Orefice served as a Special Services Coordinator for the Borough of Oceanport School District. Mr. Orefice, welcome to Outlook Monmouth.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And I do want to just begin by congratulating you on your middle school, Maple Place Middle School, being named a Blue Ribbon School by the Federal Department of Education. I think that deserves some recognition.
Yeah, we're indeed proud. Thank you.
Okay. Can you just generally define, what do we mean when we say special education?
Sure. Special education would refer to a student who is, through a referral by a parent, teacher, state body, such as a Division of Family Services or an early intervention service, is referred and being identified as perhaps having a disability. Now, once that referral is put into place, they are subsequently evaluated by a school's child study team, which has professionals that are trained in those areas, and ultimately they are classified as having a disability. And that disability can be something as slight as, and not to minimize it, but as slight as a reading disability to something that is to a child who could be multiply disabled physically. And that disability adversely affects or impacts their right to an education.
So what kind of disabilities do you see in a school district? I mean, what sort of things can affect a way a student learns?
We see communication disorders. We see reading difficulties. We see students who are autistic. So there's a whole host of ways in which children are classified as being disabled.
I mentioned in the opening that the law requires that children who are disabled and have been classified through this process receive an individualized education. Mm-hmm. What does that mean?
It actually refers to a plan that is created, constructed by members of the school's team, teachers, therapists, and the parent, interestingly enough, and in some cases even the student, where they identify those things, those accommodations that it would take to help a child in the classroom. I referred to before, they're adversely affected by their disability to learn. So those are things that would help them be on the level of a student without a disability.
Now, it used to be in the bad old days that if a child had a disability, you would isolate that child or send them to another school or another classroom or keep them apart from the general student population. I take it that's hopefully no longer the case.
Thankfully, that's no longer the case.
So what do schools do now? I mean, do they incorporate children with disabilities in a general education environment?
For the most part, we were actually mandated to be as inclusive as possible, inclusive in what we call the mainstream, the typical regular classroom, if you will. And that could mean a child, in order to be in that classroom, could have the assistance of an aide, could mean that the teacher needs to repeat and clarify directions. It could be preferential seating. Perhaps the student should be sitting in the front of the room to hear better. But it's to, yes, put them in a regular classroom. And the dividends, the benefits are tremendous.
Well, why is that important to have them in a general education environment with other students?
Sure. When we see students with a disability amongst what we call typically developing peers or regular ed students, and you hate to use that word regular ed versus special ed, but it is language of the code. We see that they're challenged. They see ways to read, study, so they generally try to emulate those pro-social and positive behaviors and study skills. But it's also good for those students to be exposed to students who are not like themselves. Makes the world a better place.
What's a pro-social study skill?
Well, they're separate, but pro-social skills. Those are skills where you look a person in the eye when you speak, you have a greeting with a handshake, those things that some students with disabilities struggle with.
And study skills, even developing that?
Absolutely. How to take notes, how to organize, how to even write down homework, and be able to put the books necessary for homework in your book bag and take it home.
How do you recognize when a child has a disability? How do you decide that something rises to the level of a disability that impacts a child's education, and that at that point they're going to receive some additional services?
For a school-age child, generally it is done by teachers who obviously have experience and training where they can see a difference, or they can in some cases hear a difference in terms of speech. However, before school age, it's typically a parent, could be a pediatrician or some other social service organization that would see it, recognize it. Perhaps they've had a child older and they are comparing their development, so they would alert the schools. Oftentimes it is, though, the teaching staff that would refer a child because they're all there to help.
And okay, so a teacher might pick up a sign of a disability, or that the child's having some issues or some problems, or maybe a parent might alert the school that we're having an issue or having a problem. There doesn't seem to be a progress, or there might be some sort of processing issue. Well, then what? At that point, okay, there's been a referral. Then what does the school do?
Well, the referral comes in the form of a letter, phone call. The school has strict time frames by the code to set up a planning meeting to invite the parent in. By the way, the parent can bring an outside body, even a pediatrician, a therapist that they might be working with, and they have to set up what we call a planning meeting. And that's to go over the nature of their information. Could be a physician's report, a therapist's report. Hear their concerns, listen to them, that's the key. And then decide what tests, if necessary, they would like to do to try to go further to identify what the child may be lagging on.
So if a parent suspects anything, and I think, I'm the father of a young daughter. I know you're the father as well. If you suspect something, if you see something, don't wait. Immediately report it to the district. Is that your advice?
Absolutely.
Try to be proactive and get the information out as quickly as possible.
Especially when you're before you're 4 years old. If you're 3 years old, 2 years old, you should already be, first of all, been referred to maybe early intervention if it's something that's glaring or your physician has recommended it. But you should alert the school district by phone, by letter, let them know so they can plan. And they could also give you advice. Although you may not be theirs in terms of age yet, they can help you and lead you in the directions to seek assistance until they are of school age.
And okay, so there's a referral, and you set up this planning meeting. And what is the purpose of the planning meeting? You decide what evaluations are going to be necessary?
There's several types of evaluations, and the school should do their due diligence, explain them very carefully.
What kind of evaluations are there?
Typically, there's an educational evaluation, which is conducted by the school's learning consultant. There's a psychological evaluation, generally conducted by the school psychologist.
And these are just tests? Are they?
They're a battery of tests with very specific items on them, from letter reading, just to give you an example. And they are very specific in terms of when they're scored. A parent has a better window, a more specific window or a specific idea of the nature of the disability. And by the way, the child study team may say that your child really does not have a disability.
Once the evaluations are completed, and do school professionals, they take on that role? They actually provide the evaluations?
Yes. A parent has the option to use an outside evaluation, in which the school would consider in their decision making, but the school is charged with that task.
And once the evaluations are completed, well, then what?
Well, then they're explained to the parent, and once there's understanding, again, the parent as a member of the decision-making team, decisions are made as to how to best accommodate what is ever diagnosed, for lack of a better word, or shown, illustrated, to assist the child in the classroom.
Okay, so parents are actually part of the team?
Absolutely. In fact, a meeting cannot take place other than, a consent, but without the parent. Equal member.
Okay, and do you still see? I mean, it used to be there was a stigma with special education that maybe parents wouldn't want that designation or classification because of some negative feeling about it. Is that still the case?
It's getting less and less, thankfully. There are some cultures that still have that stigma, interestingly enough. It's our job, and I say the school district's job, the child study team's job, to try to overcome any kind of stigmas or barriers that a parent may have and try to kind of lessen their fears. Oftentimes it's fear. Everyone wants their child to be like the neighbor's child, and sometimes it's hard to accept. But oftentimes, yes, parents are accepting of it.
Can a parent decline services? And this is something that, I've had some experience with, but can a parent actually, despite the fact that the evaluations come back and it appears the child has a disability, and it appears that the child requires some special services, can a parent say, no, thank you, while I appreciate your efforts, I don't believe my child requires these services and I don't want them classified?
Yes, and actually the school district can, and I don't want to get into the legal minutia, leave that to you, but a school district also, if they disagree with the parent not choosing the services, they can, if they believe it's really in the child's best interest, a school district can try to, in a legal way, force the parent into the services.
I take it that's not a position the district wants to be put in, though?
That's correct.
Okay, so how often does that take place, that you have a conflict with respect to whether or not my child is classified?
Very rare.
Very, very rare. And so what are the more, you said you see a lot of specific learning disabilities, you see, what other kinds of disabilities are on the forefront or on the rise today?
No doubt nationally, but particularly here in New Jersey, is obviously autism.
Autism. Yeah, you do read a lot about autism. Is it a problem that seems to be, well, first of all, let's define our terms. What is autism? Autism
is it's a pervasive developmental disorder that is measured on a spectrum or continuum with a high and a low. And generally, autism focuses around communication and social deficiencies or disabilities.
Give me some examples of how autism would affect a young child.
Again, primarily through communication and social skills. And at times, a child they describe it as almost being in their own world. They may not have, they may not be able to focus, or they may not be able to, learn because of not being able to communicate, not being able to encode or decode words, read. So it's.
You said it's a spectrum disorder.
Yes.
What does that mean?
It means we call a high end of the spectrum and a low end of the spectrum. Obviously, someone on the high end would be greater functioning with their autism. They may be able to communicate. They may be They may be able to have good social skills. And on the opposite of that would be someone who, unfortunately, in some cases, can't speak. Does not have any social manners, positive pro-social manners. Yeah. So it's a tragedy, and New Jersey is seeing a increase. And
we'll get to that. But for now, we have to go to a short break. Please stay with us for more about special education here on Outlook Monmouth.
Any questions?
No.
You know. We're not magicians, we can't read your mind.
We need your questions, each and every kind.
What are the side effects, doctor?
How many times have you done this before?
Questions are the answer.
Will this react with my other medicine?
Hey, what are all these tests even for?
You have the power to say what's on your mind.
We need your questions, each and every kind.
Questions are the answer. Questions are the answer.
Turn it down. Lowering your thermostat just 1 degree can cool your heating cost by 3%. Answer the call.
This could be good. Hey, you.
Welcome back to Outlook Monmouth. I'm your host, Armen McOmber. If you're just joining us, we're talking about special education with Andrew Orefice, who serves as superintendent of schools for the borough of Oceanport. Before accepting his position as superintendent, Mr. Orefice served as special services coordinator for the borough of Oceanport. Mr. Orefice, before we went to the break, one of the things we were talking about was autism. And it appears, and again, I'm someone who does a fair amount of educational legal work, it appears, at least to me, and I think to a lot of people, that there are more children with autism these days than ever before. Does that appear to be the case to you?
Certainly.
Okay. And is that, you hear different theories about that. One is that, well, New Jersey does a better job of detecting the disorder and classifying these children than other states, or that in general the country is doing a better job of detecting it. Or you do hear about there's something in the environment, there's something systemic, something going on nationwide and even worldwide, which is causing this increase. I mean, based on your experience, I know you're not a physician, but you certainly deal with parents of autistic children. You're certainly aware of the research that's going on out there. Can you hazard a guess as to what's causing this spike in autism?
Well, there's certainly no doubt that we see a spike in it. And I think all those factors you had mentioned or alluded to should be taken into account. Certainly there's been studies on both sides, so that it gets quite controversial at times. But New Jersey has done a great job in identifying autism.
When you say studies on both sides of what?
Both sides of issues, such as there are those people who suggest that autism is a result of vaccinations, childhood vaccinations. There are those who believe it's environmental, from toxins in the air, even cleaning products, things like that. So you hear both sides that would hold up studies. They certainly should all be taken into account for a fair focus as to the causes.
So as it stands right now, we don't know, meaning the educational community, the medical community, we have no idea what causes autism. Is that correct?
That's correct. Okay,
so we know it's increasing. I mean, and it's not just that we're doing a better job of detecting that. Does that sound about right?
That sounds about right.
Okay, and are the cases more severe, or does it across the spectrum?
I think it's across the spectrum.
Okay. And I guess one of the things you're dealing with is parents come to you, and do they tend to have certain preconceived notions about what's causing autism? And do you find yourself reacting to that? For instance, I was watching television the other night, and Jenny McCarthy was talking about vaccinations, was crediting some sort of intestinal cure for autism. I mean, do you find, and I don't have anything to say about Jenny McCarthy or what she says, but I mean, do you find yourself dealing with these kinds of issues?
Oh, sure, and we're respectful of them. We hear all different sides of the issue. We hear different perspectives. We hear people who do different types of research with the internet now. There's many groups out there that are providing them with different informational sources. But we're respectful of them, and we have to do our due diligence to help the child. It's about the child.
And what kind of services, do these children require?
Usually therapies, particularly speech therapies. At times, occupational therapy, physical therapy, and even social skills therapies. And
in terms of the expense, and I think that's one of the issues that what we're seeing. I mean, these services are expensive, are they not?
Generally, yes.
And why is that?
Well, there's a whole host of reasons, but let me put it into perspective. The first is, again, I alluded to earlier, we are under a mandate to try to educate all students in the least restrictive environment, what they call LRE, least restrictive environment, which means that we should try to educate autistic children in their community school, their local school. They're in the typical classroom that, say, if they're in fourth grade, a fourth grader would be in. Okay, so in doing so, as I mentioned before, oftentimes we have to supply an aide, and the aide requires a salary, in some cases benefits. The therapies, we have to employ a speech therapist, a physical therapist, an occupational therapist. At times we have to bring a behaviorist in to assist the child and the teacher with proper reward structures to help make the behavior more positive. So there are a whole host of costs. Now on the other side of it, it's when the child study team agrees that perhaps the community school is not in the child's best interest to educate, and then we have to send the child to an out-of-district placement. That's, of course, always the last resort for any school district. No school district wants to send a child out of district. However, when the child's study team, again, including a parent, agree that that's the best place to manage and to educate the child, that is extremely costly.
And these are services that, frankly, these children require. I mean, there's no question that the district has to provide them to make sure the child has a chance at a meaningful educational benefit. So they're really, depending upon the child, depending upon what a parent is looking for, and certain circumstances, but on the whole, the types of services you're talking about, a child requiring an aide, specialized transportation, a low student-teacher ratio. I mean, these are things really the district doesn't have a choice but to provide. Is that the case?
That's generally the case, yes.
And are there ways? Also, do some children require extended school year? And that was.
Yes, that's true.
And how much is that?
It's the number has a comma in it. Put it that way.
Okay. And why do autistic children require more, in terms of the days of service than regular education children?
Because it's identified by the teacher and the child study team, particularly though by the teacher, that the gap in summer break would put the child way behind when they return to school traditionally in September. So that therefore their education needs to be continued so that they can maintain their learning and the skills that they're acquiring.
Okay. Now, districts are in a difficult position because on the one hand, they are both required to provide these services and they want to provide these services. I mean, these are services that these children need. And that's the job of the school district, is to make sure these children are educated and are provided whatever services they require to overcome their disability. At the same time, though, these services are very expensive. And just by way of example, I mean, I'm familiar with cases where an out-of-district placement could cost well in excess of $150,000 to $160,000 for one student. I mean, does that estimate seem about right to you?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. So what does a district do? I mean, how does a district cope with that kind of a cost being thrust on it? And let me ask you this. I mean, is there federal aid available?
We receive some grants through IDEA, and there's state programs such as Extraordinary Aid, but they're not consistently funded, leaving the burden on the local school district, i.e. the taxpayer.
When you say they're not consistently funded, what does that mean?
Well, there's times where you're given full remuneration. There's times where you're given half. There's times where there's a certain formula that comes up. So you can never count on the whole thing being funded.
Well, let's say a district, let's say 3 autistic children move into a district and they require services, and there's no question about it. And let's say it's a $350,000 or $400,000 hit to the budget of the district. Is that something that the local municipality just has to absorb?
Yes.
Okay, can you just raise taxes?
No, you cannot.
Why not?
Well, the state imposes, last year, a 4% cap on the growth of your budget. Interestingly enough, if you were fiscally prudent, and you built a surplus, you could only have 2% of your budget in this surplus reserve, which is nowhere near usually the costs of these tuitions.
So school districts are only permitted to have a 2% surplus?
Yes.
Okay. So if you had a couple of children with special needs who moved into a district, they could wipe out your surplus in 1 year?
That's correct.
Okay. And is the state aware of this?
I'm sure they are. And I know that I'm just one superintendent, but there will probably be about 614 others across the state that would be echoing that frustration. And let me add, it's never directed towards the family, towards the student. We understand we want to carry out the services, as you mentioned, but it is a fiscal reality.
Well, no, and parents, I mean, they are advocates for their children. They're going to look for services for their children. You're an educator. Mm-hmm. You're looking to provide these services, but it just seems that to thrust the entire cost of these services, which, we have growing autism, we have expensive services, we have a capped budget situation, you're not allowed to have a surplus. I'm just wondering how long you think this is a viable recipe. How long can this go on for? Because it just seems like at some point you're going to run out of money.
Yes, and with the state being billions of dollars in debt, I agree. I don't see how long we can continue this kind of formula.
So what is the solution to it?
Well, it depends on who you ask.
I'm asking you.
Okay. Well, one of the things that I've studied or taken a look at is something as simple as to assist us when a child from another town, municipality, school district moves into our school district. That money was, for the most part, budgeted by that community. So I believe the money should follow the student, so it would help the new school district with the cost of that child's education. I mean, that's just one little way. It would also be great if the state would give us more funds to help us with space considerations to build programs in our district. They tell us to build programs in your district and keep children within your district, but not oftentimes they don't put their money where their mouth is, quite frankly. And so that most public schools are crowded these days. If I wanted to open a program, I have no room and I would have to build.
It's interesting to me that the state has addressed, certainly blamed school districts and the number of school districts for high property taxes and the high cost of education, but it doesn't seem like the state has spent any time looking at the question of special education funding, and certainly they're not providing any more funding to the district. So you're increasingly finding yourself as a local school district required to pay for this, raising taxes to the extent that you can, eliminating your surplus. It just seems very unfair.
Yes, it does. Considering you have, so many other students to educate that need textbooks, furniture, learning manipulatives, the whole 9 yards. A building.
Learning manipulative?
Yes.
What's a learning manipulative?
Well, anything from a chart to a globe to a protractor, anything hands-on. Supplies cost money. You want to have a nice building that's clean, safe, has heat. You have utility costs. Your payroll costs rise while your aid stays stagnant.
Let me ask you quickly about this. What about when there's a conflict between parents and a school district? How does the state resolve that issue?
You usually end up in the Office of Administrative Law. And it's something that, again, I don't know of any district that ever wants to go there with a family because, truthfully, neither the family or the school district ever really wins. Special education, I believe, in Oceanport is about forming relationships, and that relationship is certainly breached or becomes adversarial when you're headed to the Office of Administrative Law. Okay.
Well, thank you very much for being here, Mr. Orefice. We appreciate it. That's all the time we have for this episode. I'd like to thank our guests for an informative discussion. Join us next time for Outlook Monmouth. And again, thank you.
Thank you.